A proposal at the state capitol would allow officers to use roadside drug tests to help detect impaired driving. Thanks for joining us at 10. I'm Mark McPherson.
And I'm Mackenzie Davis. Supporters say it could help get unsafe drivers off Wisconsin roads faster.
WMTV's Shayna Najawan joins us live in the newsroom. And Shayna, critics argue lawmakers need to be more clear about its scientific and legal limits before moving forward.
Yeah, right now suspected drug-impaired driving cases often require an arrest, blood draw, and lab testing. But Senate Bill 678 would allow a saliva swab at the roadside instead. But how that test is used is where opinions differ.
We're starting to see an increase in impaired driving, and not just from illegal controlled substances like heroin, marijuana, or methamphetamines, but also from the improper use of prescription medications.
Right now, suspected drug cases in Wisconsin often require an arrest and a blood draw, with lab results coming back later.
And this fast-acting roadside assessment will allow us to determine, which course of action to take to either confirm or deny the presence of an illegal controlled substance.
Sheriff Kalvin Barrett says the saliva swab would function like a preliminary breath test, a screening tool, not courtroom evidence.
But again, that's why this does not determine probable cause. It does not determine guilt or innocence. It just provides us with an avenue to which to investigate further to make that conclusion.
But Milwaukee defense attorney Andrew Mishlove says taking saliva is still legally considered a search.
Officers are not allowed to exercise police authority over any citizen to do a search or a seizure without a legal standard to do it. And taking a person's breath or their saliva is a search. They need probable cause.
He says the science behind saliva testing differs from alcohol testing, and that matters in Wisconsin, where the THC laws are complicated.
These devices do not measure a quantity of illegal substance. These saliva devices measure the presence of THC.
In Wisconsin, drivers can face charges for any detectable amount of certain controlled substances, even without proof of impairment. That becomes more complicated as hemp-derived THC products are widely sold in stores across the state.
In recent years, I think we've all seen the proliferation of THC products. You go to the grocery store, there's THC cookies, there's THC soda pop.
Mishlove says he's not opposed to law enforcement having tools, but argues lawmakers need to be clear about the limitations.
This is a very limited tool. This is not some sort of magic thing that's going to tell somebody whether somebody's been smoking cannabis or whether they're impaired or anything like that.
Wisconsin is one of the only states where first offense impaired driving is treated as a traffic citation rather than a criminal charge, something critics say also factors into this broader conversation. Live in the newsroom, Shayna Najawan, WMTV 15 News.
Shayna, thank you. In a statement to WMTV, the Wisconsin Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers say they oppose the bill for many reasons, saying, quote, there are serious constitutional concerns with the collection and testing of saliva. A saliva sample can reveal deeply personal biological information unrelated to impaired driving, end quote. They added the Fourth Amendment was designed to prevent this type of surveillance.